The gospel lesson today comes to us from the Gospel of Mark, reading in chapter 7. From there, he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hands on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha." That means, "Be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me, please? Oh God, may these my simple words become for us light today by the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen. The word apocalypse in Greek means to literally uncover or unveil something. It's like what my parents used to do on Christmas morning with a bed sheet when they'd run out of time wrapping presents. They would cover the pile of presents with the sheet, and after my brother and I had bounded down the steps, they would pull the sheet away and reveal all of our Christmas dreams. An apocalypse in the Bible, however, does not deal with unwrapped Christmas presents. Instead, a biblical apocalypse is a writing or a vision or an oracle or an event that helps to unveil, to uncover, to reveal to us God's dream for creation. We have in front of us today just such a text from the prophet Isaiah. This text is clearly an apocalyptic one because it uncovers for us God's dream for creation. In this vision, Isaiah sees a time when the wilderness and dry land, places of desperation and fear and loneliness, will be glad and bursting at the seams with flowers. In this vision, Isaiah sees places like Lebanon and Carmel and Sharon restored to their proper places of power and prominence. In this vision, Isaiah sees a time when God's people will no longer doubt the presence of God because God's glory will be all around. In order to prepare for this time, Isaiah says the weak must be strengthened, the feeble must be helped along, and the fearful must be encouraged. When the time of blooming and gladness and rejoicing comes, Isaiah says, the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer, and anyone who was silent will sing out for joy. The dry places will no longer be dry because streams of water will run through them. Streams will run through the desert, and the burning sand will be turned into cool pools of clear water. The places that were once haunted by predatory animals will be drowned by these floods, and reeds and rushes will grow in their place. Finally, a highway will be built there, a place where the redeemed of God will march up to Zion with singing and great joy. Sorrow and sighing shall flee away. This is God's vision for how things will be when all of creation comes into alignment with God's good will. Everything that is harmful or deadly or painful is not only put to an end, it's destroyed and replaced with something wonderful. All the stuff that needs to be reversed will be reversed. Deserts turned into rivers, burning sand into pools of water. Wilderness will be paved over with the holy way. That's God's vision. And then there's even more. God's vision is also that everything is transformed so that it can no longer go back to the way it was. The deserts will never dry up again. The holy way will never be bulldozed or torn apart. Dangerous animals and hazards have been chased away, and they're not coming back. The first hearers of Isaiah's oracle would have been exceedingly glad to hear it. They would have been glad because life was sad and precarious, always just on the edge of falling off into the abyss. At about the time of Isaiah's ministry in Israel, the nation was hemmed in on all sides by threats, secular and religious. Every day, the gods of other nations were beckoning them to come and worship and give up their faith in the one God of heaven. This wasn't a new threat. They'd faced this threat since the moment they left Egypt. But now, as they got further and further into their journey with God, they realized it wasn't quite what they thought it was going to be. At the same time, much bigger and more powerful nations were knocking on the door, ready to wipe them away. To make matters worse, there was no real leadership in Israel. Actually, that's not entirely true. There was plenty of leadership in Israel, on the throne and in the temple. But these were self-promoting, power-hungry, slimy people who did whatever they could to get wherever they wanted to go. They didn't have any interest in promoting social righteousness. They had no concern for orphans or widows or the sick. These were people who would do and say anything to gain the hearts of the people as well as their pocketbooks. One biblical writer looked on this time in Israel's history and wrote, "The word of the Lord was rare in those days." How very sad. God didn't stop speaking. The people just stopped listening. And even worse than that, people were forgetting how to listen because there was no one to show them how. It was a dry time indeed. And then Isaiah breaks onto the scene. And he tells God's people that their current reality is not their ultimate reality. He tells them that the current leadership, inept as it may be, will not hinder the movement of God. He tells them that the desert of their hearts, yearning for a good word from the Lord, will suddenly run with cool, clean water. He tells them that the barren places in their lives will burst into blooms. He tells them that the shame and the hurt of the past will be wiped away. He assures the blind and the deaf and the broken that God has not forgotten about them. He points to the highway that will lead the people to God, and he proclaims that never again will anything stand in their way. Talk about water in a dusty place. The good news of God would have lifted God's people up to face the strange and winding course of life with a hope and with a peace that could never be destroyed. The uncovering of God's ultimate plan for things would have been enough nourishment to keep the people going until it actually came to be. My friends, as I reflected more on this passage personally this week, it became very clear to me that I've had a good and privileged life. I grew up in a house with two loving parents. I was surrounded my entire childhood by a loving family, and I learned of God's love very early on. I studied in some phenomenal places and with some of the world's greatest thinkers, and I've traveled all over the States and in many foreign countries. I once heard Beethoven's Ode to Joy performed by a choir of 1,000 people. And then I was there to hear the first cry of my newborn son. I want for nothing. And on most days, there's nothing that I actually need other than the things God has so generously given to me. But these past few months have been awful. It's been awful for me and my family. I've never had any medical problems more than a common cold. But back in May, I started having some stomach pain that would keep me in bed for days. It let up enough that I was able to finish my schoolwork back in June, but it landed me in the emergency room one day, unable to move. Luckily, the doctors found what they thought was wrong, and they treated it, and I only say luckily because just a few days after that ER visit, we had to travel back to Maryland to lay my grandmother to rest. By God's grace, we were able to travel and be with my family and to grieve our loss. And Grandma was 94, so we were comforted in the length and the impact of her life. Then no sooner had we gotten back to Oklahoma, we got word that my father-in-law had been put on hospice care. At the time, it was a way for him to receive the care he needed in a way that was most comfortable. We drove that road back and forth to Texas many times. We talked final arrangements, but we didn't think we'd need any of it anytime soon. Ted even told me one time that he wasn't dying, just getting better, a whole lot slower than expected. Then we traveled back to Texas a few weeks ago because Ted had suffered a stroke. And then a day later, he died with the two people he loved the most on either side. Ever since that day, there's been this haze hanging over our house. One that we walk through almost half asleep every day. At some points, we wonder if we'll just wake up and things will be back to normal. I'm sad. All the time. My wife is sad all the time. Our families are sad, and we're dry too. And in our sadness and in our thirst, we recognize that each and every one of you here today has either been through the same or is going through it right now. It's an inescapable truth of human life that at times all the joy and the singing, it'll just be sucked away. It's an inescapable truth of human life that we will all experience the death of loved ones, and that each of us will one day join them in God's eternal home. It's an inescapable truth of human life that threats hem us in from every direction, and we'll wonder how in the world we can possibly survive. But the fact that it's true doesn't make it easy to handle. I don't know about you, but I didn't get a book. I didn't get a manual for how to go through life, and if you did, I'll buy it from you. And it sucks. And that's a word I can use because I have a seminary degree. It sucks, and sometimes that's the only thing you can say when it's most foggy and unclear. And yet, because in God's grace, there's always an and yet. God is faithful. If you want to know how I can say that today, I'd like to show you the stacks on stacks of cards that have come through our mailbox this summer. If you want to know how I can say that today, I'd like to tell you about the pecan pies and the fruit and the chocolate chip cookies that have just miraculously showed up on our front porch. If you want to know how I can say that, I'd like to tell you about every hug and every concerned look and every good wish that we received in sincerity, filled with love. And if you want to know how I can tell you that, with every terrible thing that has happened, that God is faithful, it's because your love and your grace and care, it was water in a dusty place for me, confirming that God's vision of how things will be already is. Isaiah speaks as if it's someplace off in the future, but I'll tell you today, it's right here. It's right here. God's river is already running through those dusty places, and it will never be stopped. So there's two things I want each of you to do today. First, I want you, even if it's only a thread, I want you to reach out and grab onto the hope that is our faith in Jesus Christ. The power of Isaiah's apocalypse, it's not relegated to the past, and neither is God. God is still moving. God is still acting. God is still speaking, and that means that God is still working for our good. The promises of a new and better day are just as clear and as present today as they were those millennia ago. So have hope. Have hope. God has not forgotten you. Second, I want you to reach out to somebody today. God is big and powerful and able to do anything and everything we could ever dream or imagine. And one of those big and powerful things that God has done is God has given us one another. Fellow travelers on that holy way, so reach out to somebody. Don't try to fix it. If anything, help them to intone those words, "This sucks." Cook for them, clean for them. Sit with them in the silence. Then, when the time is right, dance. Dance in those cool, clear waters of God's grace, because they're about to rush through your life and mine. May the everlasting joy of God be upon all of our heads this day. And may we obtain joy and gladness by God's grace and mercy. And by that same grace, may sorrow and sighing flee away forever. Thanks be to God.